let's get into it. What you got for us today, Joe?
We're gonna start today by talking about obstacles to effort and why do some employees try harder than others? And I wanted to talk about this today because it's a conversation that seems to pop in to a lot of the leadership training I do in and around employee engagement. And so when we talk about engagement and when you look at the research about engagement, we know that by and large, employees fall into one of three buckets. They're engaged, they're not engaged, or they're actively disengaged. And when painting that picture for leaders and talking about what each of those types of employees looks like, what each of those types of engagement, I should say, looks like, inevitably the question comes up, is every person I hire capable of landing in that engaged bucket? Do they all have the potential to get there based solely on the circumstances I create for them in the workplace? And I always think that this is a really interesting question. And I will come right out of the gate and say, I'm not certain of the answer. I have an opinion. And actually part of the next book that I'm writing may tackle some of this a little bit because it is related to where does commitment come from and how do you push the buttons and pull the levers to move people toward commitment. And what inevitably ends up happening in some of these workshops is we have these really rich conversations about obstacles to effort. Why do some employees try harder than others? When you have folks who maybe aren't giving it all they've got, is that a failure of leadership? Is that a failure of fit, of them being in the right role? And so where might you come in on the topic, Alyssa? Is every person hired for a job capable of being that rockstar, superstar employee? And if they aren't, is it a failure of the leader or the institution in one way or another?
So I love this because this actually just came up in a session this week with one of my coaching clients. Um, she's a leader and she was talking about, different ways in which she could motivate some of her team. And what might come back to is there is this unspokenness about the expectations that we have as leaders about other people's engagement. So the first thing that I feel like we have to do is name that. Is it our expectation that they're not engaged because they're not engaged at the level in which we think that they should be engaged, right? So if they're not actively pursuing manager and training roles, if they're not taking on additional duties, if they're not doing all this, that lacks the effort, that lacks the engagement, because we perhaps think that everyone wants to go to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a falsehood. We have to kind of recognize those things might be what we would want if we were in that role. Maybe that's why we're in the role we're in now in leadership. But not everybody has the desire to reach that level. So are we equating our own expectations with their level of engagement? Because those two things aren't going to equal. If we're not, and we've had these kinds of conversations with folks about they want that next rung, they want to be, to the next level, then it becomes a matter of trying to translate in real terms to their job what active engagement means. I love the teaser that you gave about your next book and about how commitment and motivation and all of that. So, and I would love to hear more about that piece of it, and also speak to, do you think I'm off base here by saying that it's sometimes a mix up between what we as leaders think the level of engagement should be for a position versus what the realities of the actual employee wants and desires for themselves are?
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on that people how their engagement shows itself really varies. Not everyone is a cheerleader. Not everyone's enthusiasm for their work is outwardly visible. We have some folks in positions everywhere who very quietly go about their work, and we would absolutely consider them engaged if you define engagement as an emotional and psychological commitment, right? People who come to work and they care and they try, and for the most part, they give it all they've got. I think some of what you speak to is the parts of engagement that are outwardly visible differ from person to person, right? Sometimes if the leader defines engagement as, I've got this person who is filled with energy, like this kind of extroverted energy, or I'm climbing my career ladder, or I'm just very verbal about my enthusiasm for the work, do we, in one way or another, rank them higher in our mental list than others? And in a lot of ways, that's probably not fair. So I think that's spot on. I think the part of this that I think is trickiest is this notion that when someone is very obviously not engaged, they are going through the motions, they are doing the minimum, they are put off in one way or another by something about the workplace. I have a lot of conversations with folks about, I've got a great employee, but, and they'll tell me all the things that he or she does well, but then they'll say they just don't seem very invested, or they just don't have any giddy up in their step. They people are running circles around them and they're just slow, or and we translate that sometimes into, and it doesn't seem like they care. And so if I've got that person on my team, I think what we wrestle with is that my fault or theirs?
Mm-hmm. And as a coach, so my question then would be, ask that question, right?
Yeah.
Because when you're talking about, doing the bare minimum and just getting by, I also, I'm thinking about my own performance in the last, I don't know, year. But honestly, within the last month, I've spoken about this on the podcast before, where I feel like I keep running towards the finish line, the tunnel. I can see it, but it just keeps moving. As close
Mm-hmm.
as I get to it, it just feels like it keeps moving away from me. And that's a real thing that is
Mm-hmm.
happening in our brains, our bodies, our souls right now for a lot of people. And so I think that the only way to discern whether it's that's going on, this just general burnout of life right now, in the midst of, again, the world changing consistently, constantly. Is it that? And should we be able to give people a little bit
Mm-hmm.
more leadway right now than we generally would 2 years ago?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that that's an imperative, right? But the first thing is you got to ask, is this, related to your job and the work that you're doing, that you're not feeling like it's worth doing any
Mm-hmm.
longer? It's no longer a fit for you? Or is this just something as a symptom of what's going on in the greater, i.e., you, the person? Because again, part of our job as a leader is to actually show and demonstrate and communicate that you care about
Mm-hmm.
the person that is doing that work, because that's engagement on your part as the leader, right?
Right. And if at some point that person showed up in a way that made you believe they were giving it all they've got and they cared, and now they're not, then the obligation becomes, what has changed? And is that a change we can recover from? And if we can't, then what are our options going forward? And I think what's really smart about what you just said, Alyssa, is that at its core, whether or not someone is giving their full effort probably does come down to it either being about the person or the position. And so if
Mm.
it's about the person, people walk through the door every day with their own baggage, right? Everything tied to how we were raised and how we define effort and what our work ethic is. Is work ethic a thing? I think it is. And all of the other circumstances, all of the other forces at work on us going on in our personal lives, with our families, with our kids, with our communities, all of these things are of course going to influence my ability to have a high motor at work or to be all in mentally at work. And so that's kind of one column on the page is if this isn't
Mm-hmm.
happening for someone, is it about the person? Is it about some of these things? The column on the other side of the page is the position. Are the circumstances of the position now falling short to ignite the drive to perform in the position? And there are so many reasons that could take place. Maybe I got a new manager and it's not clicking. I got a bad boss. Maybe I have a bad teammate. Maybe some new responsibilities that I've been given. I'm really struggling to meet those expectations, and that has slowed me down. Maybe the work has become rote, right, and become
Mm-hmm.
less interesting to me, and I need a change of scenery in one way or another in my work to light that fire again. And so that's the other column on the page, is the position. And so I think when leaders are faced with someone who isn't giving their full effort, they have to do the work to find out whether or not it's about the position, and then also do the work to find out whether it's about the person. And to a degree, you can really only control, as a leader, influencing the position, right? You could care about the person. You could care about what's going on in their personal life, and you could try to offer up resources and support for them to manage those difficulties. But if you do everything you can to offer that support and do everything you can to create the conditions at work for them to thrive, right? We talk about that a lot here on the show.
Mm-hmm.
And you've checked all those boxes and that person is still not firing on all cylinders, at the very least, you've done all that you can to try to make that happen for them. And let me point back to what I started with, which is I don't necessarily believe that every single person who gets hired and walks through the door has the capacity to be a rock star. Because some people are just lazy. And some people are just going to do the minimum. And, the sooner we accept that that's not something I can fix, if I've given that person every opportunity to rise to the occasion, to do work that interests them, to provide support, then at some point I got to say, yeah, this was just not the right person for the role. For whatever reason, they're not able to match what we need them to do. I've been going on for a while now. I'm going to stop.
Don't stop. Never stop, Joe, because you have this great ability. I want to make it all muddy and gray and ishy squishy. And I'm like, but the people and the effort and the desire and all this, you know, intangible stuff. And you're like, position and person. And you make it very easy and very succinct. And people are like, oh, yeah, that's what I can do. And I'm like, muddy, muddy, muddy. So your clarity is always welcome. I appreciate it very much.
So if we've got somebody listening who is in charge of a person that is just consistently underperforming in this way, their effort is lacking, and they've pushed all the buttons and tweaked all the levers. That was a terrible setup for that analogy. They've pushed all the buttons and pulled all the levers that they can think of to try to activate this person's drive in the workplace.
Yeah.
And they arrive at the conclusion that I have done all that I can. We've asked them to change and they haven't. What is the conversation that needs to happen next from that kind of coaching perspective in order to figure out the next step forward?
I think exactly what you just said. And I, as the HR, again, recovering HR person, I'm like, documentation, and you make sure that you've
Right.
had, documentation of every conversation you've had and all of those, and you're following your HR protocol for progressive discipline and blah, 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 blah,
Yep.
blah, right? But at its core, it's that conversation to say, we've talked about this. We've talked about this time. We've talked about it this time. We've talked about it this time. And the fact of the matter is we're still talking about it. And it's not doing uh, our organization any good. And I can't imagine that it feels good to you for us to keep having these conversations. So will be our last conversation.
Mm.
And whether it's like, okay, you're out the door that day, or whether it's the next thing,
Yep.
is your last thing, because we're not going to have this conversation. It will be, I wave to you, and wish you well, but I think it starts and ends with communication.
Absolutely. And if we've had that ongoing communication, this kind of come to Jesus moment, which is it's sometimes described as that, where we're sitting down and saying, hey, listen, we already had the now or never conversation. This isn't working. If we've had the ongoing communication, then that conversation isn't a surprise.
Right. Yeah. No. And it's not a surprise to them, and it's not a surprise to you, because and you can rest in the fact that
Mm-hmm.
you've done all that you could.
Yep. And if you've been clear about the behaviors you need that person to engage in, the changes you need them to make, and you've documented, as you said, which is so important, the pattern and the conversations, you can point and say, hey, you know what, this isn't working and here's why, and we were able to show that. And, I'm going to be an advocate for you to land in a role that is good for you and really lights you up inside so that you can show up in a way that really makes a difference wherever you land. But you can't continue here. We're both in Pittsburgh, and the former Pittsburgh Steelers head coach Chuck Noll had a famous saying. I don't know if you ever heard this about him, Alyssa. I know you're not a sports person, but I got to drop the sports analogies every once in a while.
Okay, go for it.
When he would cut players, he would sit down and he would say, it's time for you to get on with your life's work. It's not this.
Oh,
and
dang.
that might sting a little bit, but if you've had all those conversations, you can frame that in a way that I think is actually empowering for someone. You could say,
right.
It's time for you to get on with your life's work. It's not this, but I really can't wait to figure out what it is, and I really can't wait until you figure out what it is. And I hope you'll keep in touch, because I have a feeling that you're going to probably end up being happier someplace else, just based on everything we've talked about and everything we've seen together.
That's beautiful. I like that a lot. I'm not a sports person, but I like that.
Yeah, I've used that phrase in conversations before, and on the surface, it feels, I don't know, like it has sharp edges, but it doesn't seem to land that way with folks. And so take the Chuck Noll quote and use it. And remember, boss heroes, if someone is lacking effort, you have an obligation to try to address it relative to the position. Otherwise, it might be your fault. But if you tinker with all of that a little bit, and you put in the work to try to care about the person and understand what's holding them up, and no change still occurs, then it's not your fault. And the next choice is, what are you going to do about it?